I always thought Annie and I had the kind of marriage people admired. I was raised in a military household, disciplined, loyal, and direct. My dad was a retired Marine, and growing up, I was taught to respect structure and to honor commitments. That's how I approached my marriage, too. Annie, with her sharp wit and knack for numbers, complimented me in ways I didn't realize I needed. She built a successful career in finance, and I was proud of her. Or at least I used to be. Things started feeling off about a year ago. Annie had landed a major promotion at work, and while I celebrated with her, the changes in her behavior since then gnawed at me. She worked longer hours, spent more nights at client dinners, and suddenly had all these networking events she couldn't miss. I wanted to believe it was just her climbing the corporate ladder. She was ambitious. That's one of the things I loved about her. But then came the secretiveness. A new phone appeared out of nowhere. Just for work, she claimed. Her financial habits changed too. Annie was the one who handled our budget, and I trusted her with it. Lately, though, she'd get defensive if I asked about any unusual charges or discrepancies in our joint account. I wasn't trying to accuse her of anything. I just wanted answers. One day, I was sorting through the mail and noticed a bank statement addressed to Annie. We've always been open about our finances, so I didn't think twice before opening it. What I found left me confused. A personal account I didn't recognize with large deposits and withdrawals I couldn't trace. When I asked Annie about it later that night, her reaction was cold. "It's just a savings account I've had for years," she said, brushing me off. "Why are you snooping through my things?" I reminded her that it came in the mail. "We don't keep secrets, Annie. Why didn't you tell me about this account?" Her face tightened. "Not everything has to be a shared decision, Nick. I handle our money, don't I? Why are you making this a big deal?" I let it go, but it didn't sit right. Why had she been depositing so much money into a private account? And what was she withdrawing it for? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. The final straw that pushed me to act was the dress. Annie had always been stylish, but this was different. I came home one evening, and there it was, a sleek, black dress hanging on the closet door, tag still attached. It wasn't the kind of dress you wear to a work function. When I asked her about it, she laughed, saying she bought it on a whim for a girls' night out. But I'd seen her wear it a week later, paired with stilettos, when she left the house for yet another work dinner. And I'd caught the faintest whiff of cologne when she hugged me goodbye. Not hers, not mine. It was then that I knew I couldn't keep brushing aside the signs. The late nights, the defensiveness, the hidden money. Something was happening. I didn't want to believe Annie was capable of betrayal, but I also couldn't ignore my gut any longer. That night, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Annie in that dress, smelling like another man. I wanted to confront her, but I knew better than to let emotions cloud my judgment. My military upbringing taught me patience, that preparation always trumps impulsiveness. So I started small. First, I looked at our shared calendar. Annie kept it meticulously updated, so it wasn't hard to track her work dinners and networking events. I jotted down dates, noting how often she was out and how late she'd come home. Then, I compared those dates to the charges on our credit card statement. A pattern started to emerge. Fancy restaurants, hotel bars, even a boutique flower shop. She was spending money in ways she never had before. Next, I needed to get more precise. I bought a small GPS tracker online and attached it to her car. It wasn't a move I took lightly. Spying on your wife isn't exactly the foundation of a strong marriage, but at that point, I had to know. I didn't tell anyone, not my best friend Matt, not my dad, not even the guys at work. If I was wrong, I didn't want this hanging over us. If I was right, I didn't want anyone else to see my humiliation before I figured out how to handle it. The first few days, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Annie's car went to her office, stayed parked there for hours, and then came straight home. I was starting to doubt myself. Until Friday. That night, Annie came home earlier than usual. She was dressed to the nines, makeup perfect, hair pinned up in that effortless way she only did for big occasions. "Plans tonight?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Yeah, last-minute dinner with some clients from New York, she said, grabbing her purse. Don't wait up. It might go late. I nodded, watching her closely. She avoided my eyes, busying herself with her phone, and then kissed me on the cheek before heading out. As soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my laptop. Pulling up the tracker app, I watched as the Lidl representing her car made its way downtown. Not to the fancy steakhouse she'd mentioned last week, but to a different spot entirely. A boutique hotel. My chest tightened, and my hand hovered over my phone. Should I call her? Confront her? But what good would that do? If I wanted the truth, I had to play this smart. I waited about an hour before driving over. The lobby was bright and bustling, full of travelers checking in and couples chatting by the fireplace. I scanned the room, but didn't see Annie. Taking a deep breath, I approached the front desk. "Hi," I said, flashing a polite smile. "I think I left something in my wife's room earlier, but I can't remember her room number. Could you remind me?" "Annie Tracy." The clerk hesitated, glancing at the monitor. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't give out room information." I expected that, so I leaned in, lowering my voice. "I totally understand. It's just, well, it's our anniversary, and I'm surprising her. If I show up empty-handed, she'll kill me. Can you at least tell me if she's still here?" The clerk smiled sympathetically. "Let me check." She tapped a few keys, then nodded. "Yes, she's checked in." Bingo. I thanked her and walked back to my car, shaking. So she wasn't just meeting clients. She was staying here. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I parked across the street and waited. An hour passed. Then two. Finally, I saw her. Annie stepped out of the hotel, arm in arm with a man in a tailored suit. Tall, dark hair, the kind of polished confidence that screamed money. They laughed as they walked to his car, a sleek, black Mercedes. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone. I snapped a few photos, hands shaking, then slumped back in my seat. There it was. Proof. My wife was cheating on me. I drove home in a fog, my mind racing. What had gone wrong? Was I not enough for her? Or had this always been who she was, and I'd just been too blind to see it? By the time Annie came back, hours later, I was still sitting in the dark, gripping my phone like a lifeline. She walked in, looking tired but relaxed. "You're still up?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "How was the dinner?" "Exhausting," she replied. "I'm heading to bed." I watched her go, feeling the weight of the secrets between us. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The house was quiet after Annie went to bed, but I couldn't move. I sat in the dark, staring at the photos I'd taken. Her arm linked with his, the way she leaned into him, the way he looked at her. It was like I'd been sucker-punched. I wanted to storm upstairs, wake her up, and demand answers, but what would that accomplish? She'd deny it, twist it, make me feel like I was crazy. No, I needed more. The next morning, Annie acted like everything was fine. She made coffee, scrolled through her phone, and chatted about her plans for the day. "I've got a meeting this afternoon," she said, pouring creamer into her cup. "Shouldn't take long." I nodded, playing along. "Sounds good. I'll probably work on the garage." She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and headed upstairs to get ready. Watching her, I felt sick. How many times had I looked at this woman, trusting her completely, never doubting for a second that we were on the same team. Now, I couldn't look at her without wondering what else she was hiding. As soon as she left, I got to work. First, I logged into our shared bank account and combed through the charges again. I noticed something I'd missed before, a series of payments to a high-end florist. The dates matched her late nights. Who were the flowers for? I doubted they were coming to me. Then I checked the GPS tracker. She'd parked downtown again, not at her office. I waited, watching the little dot. Sure enough, it stayed in one spot for over an hour, another boutique hotel. I didn't need to see her walk out with a guy again to know what was happening. But I wanted proof. Something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away. That's when the idea hit me. A private investigator. By Monday, I'd found someone. His name was James Pritchard, an ex-cop with a no-nonsense attitude. I met him at a diner on the edge of town, my nerves on edge as I slid into the booth across from him. "You Nick?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, trying not to fidget. "Yeah. Thanks for meeting me." James pulled out a notepad. "Tell me what's going on." I hesitated, feeling the weight of it all. "I think my wife's cheating on me." He didn't react, just scribbled something down. "What makes you say that?" I laid it all out. The late nights, the secretive behavior, the hotel. I even showed him the photos I'd taken. He studied them carefully, then looked back at me. "You want me to follow her?" he asked. "Yes," I said firmly. "I need to know the truth." James nodded, jotting down a few more notes. "All right. I'll need her schedule, her car details, and any places she frequents. We'll keep it discreet." I handed him everything I had, the tracker logs, the credit card statements, even a photo of Annie's car. He glanced over it, then slipped it into his bag. "I'll start tomorrow," he said. "I'll be in touch." The next few days were unbearable. Annie carried on as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I tried to act normal, but every time she left the house, my stomach twisted into knots. Where was she going? Who was she with? James texted updates sporadically. Tuesday. She met him at a cafe downtown. Stayed for an hour. Wednesday. Same guy, different hotel. Took photos. Each message felt like another blow. By Thursday, I couldn't take it anymore. When James called that evening, I answered on the first ring. "I've got enough," he said. "Photos, timestamps, the works. You want to meet and go over it?" "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon. My office." That night, I could barely look at Annie. She sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, laughing at something on TV. I wondered if she was texting him. Did she feel even a shred of guilt? Or had I been so easy to fool that she didn't care? When she finally went to bed, I stayed up, staring at the wall. Tomorrow, I'd have the answers I needed. But what would I do with them? The thought of losing her, losing the life we'd built, felt like a punch to the gut. But staying with her, knowing she was lying to my face, felt even worse. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Whatever James had, I was going to confront her with it. No more pretending. No more waiting. The next afternoon, I met James in his office. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. "Everything's in there," he said. My hand shook as I opened it. Photos spilled out. Annie with the same man, entering hotels, sitting too close at dinners, even sharing a kiss in the dim light of a parking garage. Each image felt like a knife to the gut. "There's no doubt," James said. "She's having an affair. Looks like it's been going on for months." I nodded, barely able to speak. "Thanks," I muttered, shoving the photos back into the envelope. Driving home, my thoughts raced. I had the truth now cold. Hard proof. But what came next? Divorce. Confrontation. I didn't know if I could handle either. That evening, I waited for Annie to come home. When she walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. Her eyes flicked to the envelope, and I saw it. The faintest hint of panic. "What's this about?" she asked. I pushed the photos across the table. "You tell me." Her face went pale as she flipped through them. For a moment, she was silent. Then she looked up, her expression cold. "You were spying on me. That's what you're focusing on." I snapped. "Who is he, Annie?" She didn't answer, just stared at me, defiant. "You've already decided, haven't you? So what's the point of this?" I felt the anger bubbling up, but I held it back. "The point is, I deserve the truth. Don't you owe me that much?" Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. Annie sat across from me, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The photos were still spread out on the table between us. Finally, she broke the silence. "His name is Daniel," she said quietly. "He's a client." "A client," I repeated, my voice sharp. "Do all your clients get dinner dates and hotel rooms?" Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. It wasn't like that at first. It started out professional. But then, I don't know, things got complicated. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Complicated? Annie, you've been lying to me for months. While I'm here holding everything together, you're out living a double life. She flinched at my words, but the defiance returned quickly. You're not perfect, Nick. You're so focused on control, on order, that you don't see how suffocating it is. Suffocating, I said, standing up. I gave you everything. Trust, support, loyalty. And you repay me with this. She stood too, her voice rising. Maybe if you paid attention, you'd have seen how unhappy I was. Her words hit like a slap. So this is my fault. You couldn't talk to me, but you could run to him. Annie didn't answer. She just stared at me, a mix of guilt and anger written all over her face. Finally, she said, I'm sorry, Nick. I didn't mean for it to get this far. That's not good enough, I replied, my voice cold. I need to know. Are you in love with him? The hesitation before she answered said all. I don't know, she whispered. I nodded slowly, my jaw tightening. Then I guess I know where we stand. The rest of the night passed in silence. Annie stayed upstairs, and I slept on the couch. I didn't trust myself to be in the same room as her without saying something I couldn't take back. By morning, I'd made a decision. When Annie came down, she looked like she hadn't slept either. I stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, waiting. She froze when she saw me. We need to talk, I said firmly. She sat at the table, avoiding my eyes. What more is there to say? Plenty, I said, my voice steady. I need the truth. How long has this been going on? She sighed, finally meeting my gaze. 6 months. The number hit me harder than I expected. Half a year of lies. Half a year of watching her walk out the door, thinking everything was fine. Does he know about me? About our family? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He knows I'm married. I clenched my fists, biting back the anger. And he didn't care. It's not like that, she said quickly. He didn't push me into this. Don't defend him, I snapped. You both knew exactly what you were doing. Annie shrank back, but I wasn't letting her off the hook. Here's how this is going to go, I said. You cut him off. Completely. No calls, no texts, no meetings. Nothing. She blinked, startled. Nick, And I interrupted. We're getting a DNA test for the kids. I need to know the truth about everything. Her face turned pale. Nick, don't do this. I'm not asking, I said sharply. This is the bare minimum if you want any chance of fixing what's left of this marriage. For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and guilt. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. But as she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words were hollow. Just another lie in a sea of them. The next few days were a blur. Annie kept to herself, trying to act as if things were normal, but the tension was suffocating. I arranged for the DNA test, something I never thought I'd have to do. It felt like betrayal on top of betrayal, but I couldn't live with the doubts gnawing at me. I went with her to the clinic. She didn't argue, just sat quietly as they swabbed her, me and the kids. Our youngest, Emma, didn't understand why we were there. Why do they need our spit daddy? She asked. I forced a smile. It's just for a health check, sweetheart. Annie looked away, her face a mask of guilt. She knew the truth of what we were checking, and the weight of it hung between us. The results came back 2 weeks later. I opened the envelope alone, my hands trembling. My heart sank as I scanned the page. Emma was mine, but Liam, our oldest, he wasn't. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that paper, trying to process it. All the memories of raising Liam, teaching him to ride a bike, his first soccer game, the way he'd always say I was his hero, they felt tainted now. He wasn't mine, but he was. He was my son in every way that mattered, and yet the biology screamed otherwise. When I confronted Annie that evening, she was already on edge. She knew the results had come in. It's Liam, isn't it? She asked quietly, tears in her eyes. I held up the paper. How long have you known? Her face crumpled. I suspected, but I wasn't sure. You suspected, I said, my voice rising. You've let me raise him, love him, believe he was mine, all while you were hiding this. Tears streamed down her face. Nick, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you. And I thought. You thought I'd never find out, I interrupted. You thought you could keep lying, and I'd never know the difference. She reached for me, but I stepped back. I love Liam, she said. You love him too. Nothing changes that. I shook my head, struggling to keep my voice steady. It changes everything, Annie. It changes how I look at you, at us, at this whole marriage. What do you want me to say? She cried. That I'm a terrible person? That I ruined everything? I already know that, Nick. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, and felt the last shred of trust between us dissolve. You didn't just ruin our marriage, I said quietly. You've broken this family. Her sobs filled the silence as I turned and walked out of the room. I sat in the garage for hours that night, the DNA results clutched in my hands. The air was thick with the smell of old wooden motor oil, but it felt calmer than the storm raging inside me. The paper trembled in my grip, mocking me with its sterile lines of truth. Liam wasn't biologically mine, and yet he was my son. He'd always be my son. That wasn't even the question anymore. The real question was, what now? When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet. Annie was sitting on the couch, clutching a throw pillow, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as I entered, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, but I held up my hand. I'm not ready to talk, I said flatly. Not tonight. Her shoulders sagged as I walked past her, heading upstairs to check on the kids. Emma was sound asleep, her little stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Liam, though, was awake, sitting up in bed with his book. He looked up and smiled when I came in. Hey, Dad, he said, his voice soft. Can you help me with this word? I walked over, kneeling beside him. My chest ached as I leaned in to see what he was pointing to. Perseverance, I said, my voice cracking. It means not giving up no matter how hard things get. He grinned. That's a cool word. Yeah, I murmured, ruffling his hair. It is. The next morning, Annie tried to talk to me, but I wasn't ready. I needed space to think. I needed time to breathe. I called out of work and went for a long drive, winding through the back roads outside of town until I found myself parked at the lake we used to visit when we first got married. It was empty, quiet, the water rippling gently in the breeze. Memories of better times flooded back. Picnics on the shore, Annie laughing as she tossed pebbles into the water, the way her hand had always fit so perfectly in mine. How had we gotten here? How had we gone from being each other's safe place to this? I thought about Liam. He didn't deserve this. None of this was his fault. He was my son, no matter what biology said. But could I stay in this marriage for him? For Emma? Was that even the right thing to do? I sat there for hours, letting the questions roll over me until the sun dipped low on the horizon. Finally, I drove home, a plan starting to take shape in my mind. When I walked in, Annie was in the kitchen making dinner. She glanced up, her face a mix of hope and fear. Can we talk now? She asked softly. I nodded, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. She sat across from me, twisting her hands nervously. I've been thinking, I started, my voice calm but firm. I need time to figure out what I want, what we're going to do. Annie swallowed hard. I'll do anything, Nick. Whatever it takes to fix this. I shook my head. You can't fix this, Annie. You made choices. Choices that tore apart everything I thought we had. Tears welled in her eyes. But I pressed on. This isn't just about the affair, or the fact that Liam isn't mine. It's about the lies, the deception. How do I trust you again after this? She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. I'm not saying it's over, I continued, but I need space. I'm going to stay in the guest room for now, and we're going to therapy, together and separately. That's non-negotiable. Annie nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face. I'll do it, she said. Anything you need, Nick. I studied her for a moment, trying to gauge if she really meant it. You need to cut contact with Daniel. Completely. No excuses, no justifications. If I find out you've spoken to him again, we're done. I already blocked him, she said quickly. I promise. I nodded, my expression hard. This is your last chance, Annie. Don't screw it up. The days that followed were tense. Annie tried to act normal, cooking meals and helping with the kids, but there was a hesitancy in her every move, as if she was afraid of setting me off. I didn't try to make it easier for her. I kept my distance, barely speaking except when it came to the kids. Liam, though, was the hardest part. Every time I looked at him, I felt a surge of love and anger all at once. He was still my boy, but the betrayal tied to him was impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to separate the two yet. One night, as I was tucking him in, he looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes. "Dad, are you mad at me?" he asked. The question hit me like a freight train. "What? No, buddy," I said quickly, kneeling beside his bed. "Why would you think that?" He shrugged, looking down at his hands. "You and Mom are fighting a lot, and you seem sad." I swallowed hard, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Hey, listen to me. None of this is your fault, okay? Mom and I are just going through some grown-up stuff, but we both love you and Emma more than anything. That's never going to change. Promise," he whispered. "Promise," I said, pulling him into a hug. He clung to me, and for a moment, I felt like the ground wasn't shifting beneath my feet. The first therapy session came a week later. Annie and I sat in stiff silence as the counselor introduced herself and laid out the rules for the sessions. When she asked Annie to explain her side of things, I braced myself. "I made a terrible mistake," Annie said, her voice trembling. "I was selfish and stupid, and I betrayed Nick in the worst way possible. I don't have any excuses. I don't know who I was back then. I thought I was unhappy, but now I see that I was the one causing the unhappiness." The counselor turned to me. "Nick, how do you feel hearing that?" I let out a bitter laugh. I feel like it's a little late for self-awareness. I gave her everything, my trust, my loyalty, and she threw it away for some guy she'll never even end up with. Annie flinched, but I couldn't stop. She let me believe Liam was mine for 8 years. 8 years. And now I'm supposed to just, move past it. "No," the counselor said gently. "You're here to figure out if that's even possible. And if it is, how to start rebuilding." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Right now, it doesn't feel possible." Annie's tears spilled over, but for once, I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. This was her mess. It was up to her to prove she was worth the effort of cleaning it up. Therapy became a routine, though every session felt like walking into a battlefield. Annie would apologize, admit her faults, and promise change, but I couldn't shake the bitterness. Every word felt too late, too rehearsed. One session, the counselor asked, "Nick, what would rebuilding trust look like for you?" I stared at the floor for a long moment before answering. Honesty, transparency, no more lies, and time. I don't know if I can forgive her yet, but if I even try, I need proof she's committed to fixing this. Annie nodded quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Outside the sessions, things were tense. I stayed in the guest room, and while we were polite for the kids' sake, the distance between us was palpable. She tried to involve me in family dinners and outings, but I often declined, needing the space to sort through my emotions. Liam remained my anchor. Every time he called me Dad, it grounded me. He didn't know the truth, and I didn't plan on telling him. Whatever his biology, he was mine, and I was determined not to let my feelings toward Annie change that. One evening, as I helped him with his homework, he asked, "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" I hesitated, but forced a smile. "We're working on it, buddy. Grown-up stuff takes time." He nodded thoughtfully. "You'll figure out. You always do." His faith in me brought a lump to my throat. If nothing else, I owed it to him and Emma to at least try. For now, that was all I could give. In the weeks that followed, Annie made noticeable changes. She deleted her private accounts and handed over her phone willingly. She didn't just promise transparency. she practiced it. If she got a text or an email, she showed it to me before I could even ask. Her work schedule became an open book, and she stopped staying late unless absolutely necessary. But none of it felt like enough. It wasn't that I didn't see her trying. I did. But the cracks ran too deep. Every time she said, "I love you," it fell hollow, like an echo of what we used to have. I couldn't shake the images James had given me, the truth about Liam's paternity, or the years of lies that had stacked between us. One evening, she approached me as I sat on the couch, flipping through a sports magazine. "Nick," she began cautiously, "can we talk?" I set the magazine down, my expression neutral. "What is it?" "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever fix," she said, sitting beside me. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "But I need to ask, are you still willing to try? Or are we just going through the motions for the kids?" Her question hit like a gut punch. I'd asked myself the same thing countless times. Was I staying because I thought we could salvage something? Or was I just biding my time? "I don't know yet," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. "I'm still trying to figure out if I can forgive you, or even trust you again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "I understand. I hope you'll give me the chance to prove I'm worth it." I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't know if she ever could. The days blurred together. Annie's efforts didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. She was attentive to the kids, went out of her way to include me in family moments, and even started cooking my favorite meals. It was like she was trying to rewind the clock, to erase the damage. But no matter how much she tried, the shadow of what she'd done lingered over everything. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Annie came into the guest room. She hesitated at the door, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Mind if I sit?" she asked softly. I nodded, and she handed me a mug before sitting on the edge of the bed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I've been thinking about Liam," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About whether he should know. About the DNA." My stomach twisted. It was a conversation I'd been dreading. "He's 8, Annie. What good would it do to tell him? He'd only be confused and hurt." She nodded, her eyes on the floor. "I know. But what about when he's older? What if he finds out some other way? I don't want him to feel like we lied to him." The thought of Liam finding out on his own was terrifying. But so was the idea of sitting him down someday and explaining this mess. "We cross that bridge when we get to it," I said firmly. "For now, he doesn't need to know. He's my son. That's all that matters." She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you for loving him like that, for not letting my mistakes ruin that bond." Her words should have softened me, but instead they stung. "I love him because he's my son," I said. "That has nothing to do with you." Annie flinched, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, standing to leave. "Good night, Nick," she said quietly. I watched her go, the weight of everything between us pressing down like a storm cloud. I wasn't sure if we'd ever find a way out of this, but for now, all I could do was take it one day at a time. Weeks passed, and while the tension between Annie and me remained, there were moments, fleeting but real, that felt almost normal. One Saturday morning, Liam had a soccer game, and for the first time in months, we all went together as a family. Annie packed snacks for the kids, Emma brought her favorite stuffed bunny, and I carried the foldable chairs to the sidelines. Watching Liam sprint across the field, his cheeks flushed with excitement, I felt a pang of pride. He was my son, no matter what biology said. When he scored a goal, he looked straight at me, his face lighting up. I couldn't help but stand and cheer, clapping louder than anyone else. "Good job, buddy," I called, my chest swelling as he grinned and gave me a thumbs up. Annie leaned over, her voice soft. "He's so lucky to have you." I didn't respond, but for a moment, her words didn't sting as much as they usually did. Later that evening, after the kids were in bed, Annie knocked on the guest room door. This had become her routine, trying to bridge the gap between us, one hesitant conversation at a time. "I wanted to thank you for today," she said, stepping inside. "It meant a lot to Liam that you were there." "It's where I should be," I replied. "For him." She nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which fidgeted nervously. "Do you ever think we'll get past this?" she asked, her voice trembling. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "I don't know, Annie. Some days, maybe. Other days, it feels impossible." She nodded again, her eyes glistening. "I just want you to know, I'm not giving up." I studied her for a long moment, trying to decide if I believed her. "It's going to take more than words," I said finally. "And time. A lot of time." She reached out, her hand hovering over mine before pulling back. "I'll wait as long as it takes," she whispered. When she left the room, I stared at the closed door, unsure if I felt relief or something else entirely. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a flicker of hope buried somewhere in the rubble. The days that followed were quieter, almost peaceful. Annie continued to tread carefully around me, trying to create moments of connection without pushing too hard. I could see the effort in everything she did, making my coffee exactly how I liked it, leaving little notes in the kids' lunches, stepping up for the school runs when she knew I needed a breather. But the weight of everything she had done still lingered, an unspoken presence in every interaction. One evening, Emma came running into the living room, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. Daddy, look at what I made in our class." I crouched down as she held up a colorful drawing of the four of us standing in front of our house. The words "my family" were scrawled in big, uneven letters at the top. My throat tightened as I looked at the smiling stick figures. To Emma, nothing had changed. She still saw us as a happy family. For her sake, and Liam's, I wanted to believe that could still be true. "Wow, this is amazing," I said, ruffling her hair. "You're getting so good at drawing, sweetheart." She beamed, running off to show Annie. A moment later, Annie walked into the room, holding the drawing. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "She's so proud of this," she said softly, holding it up. "It's beautiful." "It is," I agreed, keeping my tone neutral. Annie hesitated, then sat down on the arm of the couch. "Do you think we could ever be like that again?" she asked, gesturing to the drawing. "The family she sees us as." I stared at her, the vulnerability in her voice catching me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to, for them. But wanting it and getting there are two very different things." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might cry again. Instead, she straightened up, forcing a small smile. "I'll keep trying," she said, "even if it takes forever." That weekend, we had another therapy session. The counselor had been pushing us to focus on communication, not just saying what we felt, but truly listening to each other. That day, she asked Annie a pointed question. "If you could go back and change one thing, what would it be?" Annie didn't hesitate. "Everything," she said. "I'd stop myself the first time I let things with Daniel cross the line. I'd stop myself from lying, from hiding things. I'd tell Nick the truth about Liam sooner." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I know I've destroyed his trust in me, and I don't blame him for that. But I wish I could go back and make better choices, not just for us, but for the kids. I hate that they've been caught in the middle of all this." The counselor turned to me. "Nick, how does it feel to hear that?" I stared at Annie, trying to gauge if her words were genuine. "It's hard to believe," I said honestly. "I hear what she's saying, but it doesn't erase what she did. And it doesn't change how much damage has been done." Annie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I don't expect it to fix anything. I want you to know that I hate myself for hurting you." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I looked away, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. That night, after the kids were in bed, Annie knocked on the door of the guest room. This time, she didn't wait for permission to come in. She stood in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously. "I've been thinking about what you said in therapy," she began, "about how words aren't enough." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "I know I can't erase what I've done," she said, her voice shaking. "But I want to show you that I'm serious about rebuilding what I broke." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made an appointment with a lawyer," she said, "for a post-nuptial agreement." That caught me off guard. "A post-nups?" I asked, frowning. She nodded, stepping closer. "I know you don't trust me, and I don't blame you. But this is my way of proving I'm committed to fixing things. If I ever betray you again, if I ever break your trust, you can leave me, and I'll give you everything. The house, the savings, full custody of the kids. I'll sign it all away." I stared at her, stunned. "You'd really do that?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Because I don't want you to feel trapped. I want you to stay because you want to, not because it's easier than leaving." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. "I'll think about it," I said finally. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "That's all I'm asking." As she left the room, I sat there, staring at the paper in my hands. Maybe, just maybe, she was serious about changing. And maybe, just maybe, I was willing to let her try. Annie's offer of a post-nuptial agreement lingered in my mind for days. It was a bold move, one I hadn't expected. Signing everything away if she ever betrayed me again wasn't something you did lightly. But even as it showed her commitment, it wasn't enough to erase the doubt that had taken root deep in my chest. Could I ever truly believe in us again? One evening, after another tense but polite family dinner, I went for a walk. It was a quiet night, the cool air doing little to calm the storm in my head. My steps led me to the park near our house, the same place Annie and I used to go when Liam was just a baby. I sat on a bench, staring at the swings as memories rushed back. I could see Annie laughing, pushing Liam in the baby swing, her eyes bright with love and joy. Back then, everything felt simple. We were young, hopeful, and fully committed to building a life together. Now, those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Annie. "Kids are asleep. I made tea if you want some. No pressure." It was such a small thing, but it reminded me of the Annie I'd fallen in love with, the one who always thought of others, who found joy in the little acts of care. For a moment, I wondered if that Annie was still there, buried under the mistakes and lies. When I got home, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Annie was sitting at the table, a mug of tea in her hands. She looked up as I walked in, surprised but hopeful. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," she said softly. I sat down across from her, not touching the tea she'd poured for me. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice measured, "about us, about what comes next." She nodded, her hands tightening around the mug. "And I don't have a clear answer yet," I admitted. "But I've decided one thing. If we're going to try, it has to be real. No half measures. No more secrets. If you're hiding anything else, now's the time to tell me." Annie swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "There's nothing else, Nick. I swear. Everything's out in the open now." I studied her face, searching for any sign of deceit, but all I saw was exhaustion and raw honesty. For once, I believed her. The next day, we sat down with a lawyer to draft the post-nuptial agreement. Annie didn't hesitate, didn't flinch as the lawyer explained the terms. She agreed to everything. Full custody of the kids, all financial assets, and even an agreement to pay spousal support if I chose to leave. It was a harsh document, but she signed it without a second thought. As I watched her, part of me wanted to believe that this was enough, that her actions now could outweigh the damage she'd done. But the other part of me, the part still wounded, wondered if I was setting myself up to be hurt again. That weekend, we took the kids to the zoo. It was Annie's idea, and while I was hesitant, I knew how much it would mean to Liam and Emma. The day was almost normal. Liam dragged me to every exhibit, excitedly pointing out his favorite animals, while Emma clung to Annie's side, chattering about the giraffes. At one point, as we stood watching the lions, Liam grabbed my hand. "This is fun, Dad," he said, his face beaming. "I'm glad we're all here together." Something inside me softened at his words. I glanced at Annie, who was watching us with a tentative smile, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this family wasn't beyond saving. Maybe, if I could find a way to let go of the anger, we could start again. That night, after the kids were asleep, Annie approached me in the living room. "I saw you smiling today," she said, sitting down beside me. "It's been a while." "Don't read too much into it," I replied, though my tone was less harsh than it had been. She nodded, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I know this is going to take time. I know I've broken something in you that might never fully heal. But today, it gave me hope." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman I'd loved for so many years. She was still there, beneath the guilt and regret. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," I said finally, "but I'm willing to keep trying. For the kids. For us. But mostly for me. I need to know I've done everything I could before I make any decisions." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "That's all I've been hoping for," she whispered. For the first time in months, I didn't pull away when she reached for my hand. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. Months passed, each day feeling like a cautious step forward. Annie and I settled into an unspoken rhythm, one built on small efforts and tentative trust. Therapy became a constant, not just for us as a couple but individually. I needed to process my anger, my grief, and my sense of betrayal. Annie needed to confront the choices that had brought us to this point and the deeper cracks they revealed in her character. One night, after putting the kids to bed, we sat on the back porch, a bottle of wine between us. The air was warm, the stars faint but steady in the sky. It had been a good day, nothing remarkable, but peaceful. No fights, no tension, just quiet. "I've been thinking," Annie said, breaking the silence. Her voice was hesitant, careful. "About us. About everything." I looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "I know I've asked you for forgiveness more times than I can count," she said. "And I know it's not something I can rush. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm grateful. Grateful that you stayed this long, that you gave me a chance to prove myself." Her words hung in the air, and for once, I didn't feel the urge to counter them with anger or bitterness. Instead, I felt a strange calm, a sense of acceptance I hadn't expected. "I didn't stay for you," I said after a moment. "At least, not at first. I stayed for the kids. For Liam and Emma. They deserve stability, no matter what's happened between us." Annie nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know. But now," I continued, my voice steady, "now, I'm starting to see the woman I fell in love with again. The one who made me feel like the luckiest guy in the world. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, we can find our way back to that." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then she reached out, her hand covering mine. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that we can." The real turning point came a few weeks later. Liam had a school play, and we sat side by side in the crowded auditorium, watching him recite his lines with a confidence that made my chest swell with pride. As the applause erupted and he bowed, his eyes searched the crowd until they landed on us. He waved, his grin wide and full of joy. In that moment, everything else faded. The lies, the betrayal, the pain. All I saw was my son, the boy I'd raised, the boy who looked at me like I was his whole world. And I realized that no matter what had happened, this was what mattered most. The family we'd built, flawed and messy, but still standing. That night, as we tucked the kids into bed, Annie lingered in Liam's room. I stood in the doorway, watching as she kissed his forehead and whispered something I couldn't hear. When she turned and saw me, there was a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Back in our bedroom, not the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair. Annie sat beside me, the silence between us no longer tense, but expectant. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you completely," I said, my voice low. "But I'm ready to try. For real this time." Tears filled her eyes, But she didn't cry. Instead, she reached for my hand, her grip firm and steady. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's all I've ever wanted." In the months that followed, things didn't magically go back to the way they were. There were still moments of doubt, flashes of anger that surfaced when I least expected them. But there were also moments of connection, of laughter, of quiet joy, of rebuilding what had been broken piece by piece. Liam and Emma grew, blissfully unaware of the storm their parents had weathered. And though the scars of what had happened would always remain, they became part of a new foundation, one built on truth, on effort, and on the unwavering love we had for our children. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Annie reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked softly. I looked at her, at the woman who had hurt me more deeply than anyone ever had, but who had also fought harder than I thought possible to make things right. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "I think we will." For the first time in a long time, I believed it.